Hi everyone, thanks for joining our session today. My name is Ken, and I have a co-presenter with me today, Royston, who will be presenting to you. And the topic that we have today is the top 3 behaviors we've seen amongst the great API developers we work with at our line of work, and perhaps some of the sharing of some of the words as well. Without much further ado, let us kickstart the session today with our customers around API developers, right? Sorry, behaviors of API developers. But what I want to do is to start off with, two key statistics. Now, interestingly enough, these numbers both starts with 7. What I'll do now is I'll give you a moment to try and guess what these numbers represent. I'll give you a couple of seconds. Now, all right. If you have something in mind, keep it in your mind, and let's see if it kind of fits with what we have prepared. So I'll start with 7. Now, 7 is actually what we've seen is 7 of the top global companies by market cap, right? In recent years, are actually platform companies. Now it's actually very interesting because we're now truly seeing a shift from a product-based company to a platform-based economy of today. And what we've also seen with COVID is it has only accelerated this shift, right? And we all know that APIs are at the center of these platforms, and not just these platforms, but across its entire ecosystems as well, right? And this is very relevant to our topic today, because if APIs are the keys to be successful in this new platform-based economy, what's really then important is to think about and discuss the state of the APIs that are being produced and consumed today on a daily basis. And with that, Postman's 2020 State of the API reports actually give us a pretty interesting insight as well. And that brings me to the next number on the screen, which is 70% of the respondents for that report actually states that reliability, security, performance, and even documentation are key considerations when they think about wanting to consume an API. Now that's actually very interesting, because if you think about it, and as we are all, in a sense, developers of APIs, the success of an API is usually measured by how it's consumed. And therefore, if we don't produce APIs of such quality, then it's very clear that that may risk the APIs that we develop to be one that's successful. Now, today, let me introduce myself. My name is Ken, as I mentioned earlier. I am a solution engineering director at MuleSoft, and part of a lot of my work is around helping our customers, to adopt an API-led approach to solve their business challenges. Some of my other experiences, if you're interested, just some fun facts. I've worked with Google, I've worked with Oracle, BA Systems, and IBM WebSphere as well in the areas of APIs and integration. Also presenting with me today is Royston, and I'll let him introduce himself to everyone.
Hello, everyone. My name's Royston Lobo. I have the pleasure of working as a senior technical architect in the customer success team here at MuleSoft. I've been at MuleSoft for over 2 years now and have worked with a number of customers. I also have the privilege of leading the developer community in Sydney, as well as for the JPAC region, which is where I get to learn a lot of these insights that I'll be sharing with you today. All
right. So what will we cover today? There are 3 main, broad messages, right? The first is, of course, as we kind of shared, you will hear from some of the learnings and common challenges when it comes to API consumption, right? And with these are learnings we've gotten from all the customers that we work with. Secondly, which is a key topic of our discussion today, is around the behaviors that we've seen, the good and the bad, right, from API developers. And lastly is really how you can then take the learnings that we'll be sharing today to be an exceptional API developer yourselves. So let's move on.
Thanks, Ken. When we were putting this talk together, we were trying to understand what analogy could we use to really communicate the behaviors that we see working with API developers out there. And something that we settled upon is to use the Formula 1 analogy, because we saw a lot of behaviors both good and bad, and similarities between Formula One and API development. So bear with us today while we use this analogy. So as API developers, I think many of us are guilty of potentially seeing ourselves as the rock stars who are driving the Formula One car. You know, we look at our capabilities and our talents and potentially see that, you know, we as developers can create these amazing APIs that power the world. But something that I'd really want to shine a light on is that in any Formula One team, let alone the most successful of teams, which at this point in time is Mercedes, behind each driver is a team of up to 700 to 1,000 people that all come together in order to make this team successful. So while you as a viewer might only see the fantastically talented driver, you actually have a whole ecosystem that's coming together, putting effort, and not just the team behind the driver as well. You also have the whole Formula One industry and the governing body, the team that sets the rules. And similar to how Formula One has such an ecosystem, as API developers, we operate in an ecosystem as well. So quite often we have to adhere to standards that exist in the industry, but we also need to understand that as API developers, we are producing APIs, but quite often that there is a consumer of that API as well, who is more than likely going to be an API developer. So while we go through this presentation today, just keep that in mind that it is bigger than just one person when you go about API development. So Ken, I know you've had some thoughts around developer experience. I was wondering if what you had to share with the audience today around what you've seen in that space.
All right, thanks, Royston. I think it's actually very interesting because one of the first common themes we see among the behaviors that we've learned with our customers, right, it's this, as you just mentioned, the developer experience. Now, I think it's very interesting because oftentimes, you know, as Royston has shared, you know, API development can seem to be almost like an independent unit of work, right, where you kind of like work and deliver the API implementation as is required. But, you know, often in reality, it's like what Royston said, it's a team effort. And team here is not just, you know, the typical two-pizza team that works on the API, but really it's also about the wider set of stakeholders, right? Especially those who are consuming the APIs, both internally and externally in the organization, right? And that brings me to one of the first, you know, points I wanted to make around this theme of developer experience. And it's really around speed of consumption. Now, we all know that the success of an API is often tied to how fast an API can be consumed, right? But an interesting statistic that we recently found out is that, you know, in one of the state of the IT and business innovation report that we run on a yearly basis here at MuleSoft, we found that over 54% of LOB users are actually frustrated of how challenging it can be to stitch different systems, applications, and data together to drive business value. So what this really tells us is, you know, APIs can be built, but if it's not consumed by our stakeholders, then it's not really driving value, right? So that's an important point to take as well. So from a behavior perspective, and this is actually one you know, familiar anecdote, I'm sure you have different versions of in your experience as well, is the fact that, you know, and one of the key frictions why this is the case is what is developed, you know, the API, of course, is not what's documented. I know we all have been guilty to some extent. I know I have been, but the reality is this really does hamper, you know, the ability for an API to be consumed as quick as possible, right? To draw one similar story here, we recently worked with a customer in a project where, you know, we needed to have to connect to a couple of, you know, SOAP services, right? Now, SOAP services are still APIs, right? Now they provide us the necessary documentations. They provided us the necessary assets like WSDL files, the test data, and all that. So these were all provided. But for the longest time, when we were trying to test and use this API, we just couldn't figure out why it didn't work. Right? Turns out that the documentation was actually missing a couple of points, which is we needed to send this session token in the query parameter as we call the service endpoint. Now, obviously, this is usually not how SOAP services are design, but it is in this case. And therefore, without that being documented, we couldn't figure it out. And it took a few days to understand this missing data, because the API was actually maintained by third-party vendors, not our customers themselves. So my point here that I want to draw is, as API developers, we really need to think about, how is it that we can help our stakeholders, right? Especially the API consumers. And that could be LOB ITs, that could be, the other teams within the same project that needs to deliver different capabilities that is dependent on our APIs that we are building. We really need to think about how we can help enable our ecosystem of developers to consume our APIs, right? So that's behavior number one. It's really good behavior to document things well, but not just documenting, but really think about, how else can I improve upon the speed of consumption. Now, Royston, I know you work with a lot of our customers as well, and especially your role as a developer meetup leader, right? So is there anything you can share in terms of, understanding from that respect?
Yes, I have so much in this space. But I think to build upon the point you made there, Ken, I think the very best developers that I come across, they really view their APIs as products. And it becomes more than just a technical asset that exists. It becomes a product that they truly understand that are customers of this product. And they might not necessarily be an external paying customer. It might be an internal line of business user or somebody else within your organization. But the best developers out there, they truly seek to understand who is their consumer. And in this case, we're talking about who is their developer, because we acknowledge that majority of the time, it is a developer that is consuming that API. And once they know who their developer is, they really seek to understand how it is that they can help deliver that developer experience that is exceptional. And I think a key shining example in this space is the company Twilio. Now, if any of you don't know who Twilio are, Twilio is a software as a service company out of the States that provides messaging and chat as a service. And so, for example, they provide a variety of APIs that allow you to send messages to SMS, to WhatsApp, and other communication platforms. And Twilio have a fanatical focus on creating an amazing developer experience that really makes them stand out in the market. So if you were to go to Twilio's API documentation right now, you would see that not only can you understand how to consume the API, you would also see a live playground on their API developer portal where you can actually interact with the API and not just do it in one language, but do it in many languages. And so that's a key aspect. They really understand that developers out there are looking to consume the Twilio API as easily as possible, and Twilio has put in the effort to do that. Now, Twilio have gone one step further, and in the MuleSoft ecosystem, they've even helped develop the MuleSoft connector for Twilio. And what that means is that a MuleSoft developer can very easily consume the Twilio APIs by using the connector that works with it. And just tying all of these things together, it creates an amazing developer experience for them. Now, with the developer experience, if you want to really take it to the next level, it's all about creating a community. Now, a community in this case is a group of people who all have a shared interest. And quite often as an API developer, it's the shared interest in consuming an API that has been developed. I think a shining example for API communities that is very close to our heart here at MuleSoft is Salesforce. Now, if any of you are relatively new to Salesforce, if you go into the API documentation, you'll see that there's a tremendous amount of information around Salesforce APIs. So the documentation is really good for multiple clouds that exist. Now, Salesforce communities go one step further. So not only do you get really great documentation, you even have education through the course of the Trailhead platform. So the community has the opportunity to learn together and acknowledge the skills and show it off using Trailhead badges. And then on top of that, you have your developer forums where people can interact with each other. Now at MuleSoft, we have a product called Anypoint Community Manager, which helps create communities. But I think the key thing here is to understand that if you really want your APIs to be consumed and scale really well, it needs to go beyond you being the single point of contact as the expert on that API. You really need to understand how can you empower your API consumer to be able to create and innovate without having to get you on the phone or send you an email in order to understand how to truly use this API. So those are a couple of examples that I've seen where companies and individuals have done really well with actually innovating with APIs and just creating a fantastic experience for their consumers.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Royston. And on another set of common behaviors we now see is around implementation, right? And of course, this is at the heart of almost everything we do as API developers, implementing that API. Now in F1, each team will invest a lot of engineering resources into the design and the development of their race cars, right? But as Royston mentioned just now, they all still adhere to regulations and standards that governs the race, right? And one of these examples, it's a very simple example, is the use of standard parts by all the cars, and that could be the brake discs, the tires, the pit stop equipment, and many much more. And this brings me to the point of when we talk about implementation of APIs, we really want to simplify the implementation as well. And a lot of this comes from the point of connectivity. Now, what do I mean by this? Just like in F1, where the teams don't waste resources literally in reinventing the wheel, likewise, API development should be largely focused on reuse, so that you can then focus on developing value, right? Increasing the value chain of the API. As a coder myself, as a developer myself, I know sometimes we get into the temptation of using the latest and greatest in our dev toolkit, right? I recently picked up Golang. I think it's cool, and certainly I want to build everything with Golang. Why? Because it's cool. Now, is that the way I should do it? Probably not, right? What? Because there's so many existing frameworks out there which you can just reuse, right? And that could be libraries, existing connectors. Like in MuleSoft, we provide pre-built connectors to all the hundreds of cloud and SaaS applications out there. We provide API templates. We provide a lot of components that helps you do the ability to connect and orchestrate APIs, as an example, right? And what this gives developers like us is the freedom and time to then focus on the actual value of the API implementation, rather than building the infrastructure of the code, or etc. And one of the examples I can share is a large Australian bank that we work with, who is building now a digital first bank. They have kind of two sets of toolkit that they use to build this the digital bank. The first is, of course, as they kind of look into the microservices that they need to stand up in order to deliver the functionality and capabilities of this new digital bank. They actually standardize on Golang, right? They build all their microservices on Golang, and they deploy this all in Google Cloud Platform, as an example, right? But what they also do leverage is connectivity framework like MuleSoft, because we provide them the ability to connect to cloud and SaaS applications very, very quickly with the use of our connectors. And that's how they build these system APIs to drive and connect all this fabric of microservices and APIs together. Because when we ask them why, they said why we invent something that's already robust and available out there and just reuse it, right? And so that's the kind of mindset I want to share with you, as developers, right? There is a lot of capabilities, tools, frameworks out there that we can leverage upon, and we should, right? We should not use tools or frameworks just because we think that's the best, and not consider other right tools for the job as well. So really, one of the key takeaway I can share with you is choose the right tools for the job. Royston, on this topic, right? Obviously, it's not just about the functional side of the API implementation as well. A lot needs to go into the thoughts of non-functional requirements. Maybe can you share, with us, some of the key learnings you've you've had from working with our customers?
Of course, this one is a bit of a bugbear for me. So I think something that I really spot as a very bad behavior in API development is when I see non-functional requirements being implemented in actual code, especially when there is something better or more suited to actually implementing those requirements. So the classic one that I come across very often is when I see API authentication. So that's maybe the client ID and the client secret. It might be even tied into the actual implementation, which is terrible because it means that every time you need to provision a user or change the credentials, you have to go through the change process and introduce that additional risk that is not required. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, but isn't that the way to do it? In my opinion, the answer is no. The answer is to use the right tools for the right job. So for example, there are API management tools out there, like API Manager in the MuleSoft world, where applying access control is managed using policies. And so what that means is you decouple the implementation from the non-functional requirements that they have. So for example, if you need to provision access to a new user, you can do that at the API Manager level rather than at the implementation level. Similarly, if you need to implement rate limiting or some other non-functional requirement, you don't need to change the actual code. And if your design involves changing the code in order to implement that, then you're generally doing something that's not ideal because you're increasing the risk of the actual API, and there is a better tool out there to actually manage and implement that requirement. So always keep in mind when you are given requirements about how it is that you're choosing to implement them. As developers, we have a number of tools in our toolkit. Almost everything can be done with a library and with a piece of code, but just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it. And I think that's where, with the very best Formula One drivers, for example, the whole road is available to them, but they take the optimal line to make sure they get the fastest track time. And as API developers, I think we also need to make sure that we're operating to be fast and to be efficient, because very few of us have the luxury of spending endless amounts of time developing APIs. Almost all of us operate with constraints, and so we need to just keep that in mind when we go about our daily business. I think that leads me to my next point, which is also a bit of a bugbear for me, and that's maintenance and versioning. Now, if I was to be able to get a virtual hands up in the air for this one, I suspect that almost all of you have an experience where you've developed an API, you deployed it to production, and then nothing happened to it for the next 2 years apart from usage. There might have been no maintenance, probably no versioning, and just like almost any nice thing, APIs don't necessarily age well over time. They're not designed to get older and become more valuable that way. They're designed to be kept updated and maintained. And quite often organizations don't really understand how they should do this. So what I've seen with some of my best API customers and developers is that they actually create a maintenance schedule for APIs. And so they'll have an inventory of the APIs that they have, and then they'll create a checklist at design time to actually understand what are the different components that this API is using. So for example, an API might be using a Salesforce connector. But when you develop that Salesforce API in, say, January 2020, how are you going to make sure that it's continually being updated and maintained over time? And so these amazing API developers, they create a schedule where once every 3 months or so, they review what components the APIs are using, and then they do maintenance on them. So they might upgrade it to the latest connector. They might potentially upgrade the operating system or the runtime that the API is living on. And then they also understand that versioning is important. APIs don't just get born and live static. They need to have a life cycle where they can be versioned over time and enhanced with additional functionality. And so as API developers, when we build our APIs, we need to have a plan as to at what stage is a version 2 or a version 3 need to be developed as opposed to a version 1.1. And so just keep that in mind. If it's something that your organization doesn't currently do, then look out for frameworks. There's a number of them in the MuleSoft world, but look out for frameworks where you can understand how to do this in your own APIs that you're building and developing.
All right. Which brings us to the next topic of security. Royston, you want to share with us some of the interesting behaviors you've seen amongst our customers on this topic?
Yes. So when I think security in the Formula One world, I think safety. Now, some of you might have seen the car crash a few weeks ago where Romain Grosjean had a fiery explosion on the racetrack, and it was it was quite traumatic. But he was able to escape thanks to the amount of safety advances that have been developed in Formula One over time. And that didn't happen literally by chance. It happened because there were a number of incidents, and Formula One took action in order to implement controls to enhance safety in Formula One. And just like that, when you develop your APIs, I strongly recommend you to actually think about what are the controls and protections you're putting in place when you're building your APIs. So I think the first element of that is to really understand how you can protect your users. So if any of you have been to a Formula One track, you'll see that beyond the track, there's always crash barriers. And quite often they have advertising on them, which is a great source of revenue. But the crash barrier serves two purposes. It serves the purpose of protecting the driver from going off the racetrack and having a crash. And it serves a secondary purpose of protecting anyone behind the barrier, whether that's a race marshal or people who are attending the race. And if you think about it, these crash barriers, in an ideal world, they're never supposed to be used because the happy part is being on the racetrack. So one could even argue, why do you need crash barriers? Shouldn't the cars just always be on the racetrack? But all of us know that these crash barriers, they save lives in Formula One. And in API development, if you don't put them there, they will make the experience of your consumers terrible. And quite possibly, they might put you as an API developer or API producer at risk because of all the bad things that can happen when you don't put the right protections in place. And I think a really good example of this is in the story that was released last year. So last year around in June, a story surfaced where 100,000 details of Australians were exposed in an attack on one of Australia's largest banks, Westpac. And I think this caused a lot of concern in the financial services community because any attack or hack or security leak in financial services is bad news. But something that I think I want to really draw your attention to is how this happened. So the way this happened is that Westpac have implemented something that the industry has adopted as a new norm. It's called PayID. And what this is that the industry has adopted a method where you can be paid based on a personal detail that you have. So whether that's an email address, a mobile phone number, or some other thing that's unique to you. And so, for example, I can get Ken's mobile number and I can enter it into my banking app and say, I'd like to pay Ken $10 using this number. And in the back end, that mobile number would translate to a bank account that the system would be aware of. So what the malicious actors in this case did is that they continually hit the API that was provided for PayID and continually were able to get the details of the people who were registered with these mobile numbers. So for example, they might have randomly guessed a 10-digit mobile number, and they were able to retrieve the name of the person who owned that number, which is not publicly available information generally. So they effectively did a reverse address number lookup. Now, the bad actors in this case, they were able to do this for 100,000 numbers. These were the successful ones. I think they had 1 million hits in total. And they did this using 7 customer accounts of Westpac. So there was no rate limiting in place, and they were authenticated users of the bank, but they were able to extract out all of this information. And so as API developers, nothing technically wrong happened. It was completely authenticated. It was APIs that were provided for that use. It's just that rate limiting wasn't implemented, and they weren't thinking about the unhappy path. And this is where we really need to put our hats on during the design and development phase and understand this API that we're developing, what is the potential for abuse, and what are we doing to protect against it? Mm-hmm. And That's where, as an organization, you need to protect yourself from leaking out bad data. But as a user, you need to be protecting them from doing things that they really should not be doing or would cause them really bad consequences.
All right. And I think that brings me to a good behavior that I've seen among some of the developers we work with, right? And it's really around the same thing that Royston just mentioned, shared with us. And the good behavior that I'm mentioning here essentially is the definition of the trust boundaries. Now, this is a big topic that can probably go on for a few hours, right? But I think I'll draw to you some of the key points in this behavior. Now, the first is, these developers basically produce a threat model of the API that they're developing during design time, right? So they don't just design the API, develop the API, and then leave the security thoughts at the end. It's right up front. And because they produce this threat model in which they document how the data flows through APIs, and not just through the API, but also to all its relevant systems, they can actually then identify all the potential threats, right? And again, with that potential threats, they document them down, and then they design all the necessary controls to try and mitigate these threats. So exactly what Royston kind of shared. If you can imagine, if the developers of those APIs have thought about this upfront, they probably would have figured out that that attempt to hack those APIs might have been mitigated if they introduce rate limit. Now, is that doing that alone enough? Probably not, because if you truly define your trust boundaries and you kind of think about, because trust boundaries, sometimes we think that, and we assume, right, that if an API that's internal, so to speak, and not documented or publish its presence externally, we sometimes assume that these APIs are quote unquote safe, right? Because no one knows about it. And you kind of think about one of the infamous very, very similar leaky API hack in a few years back, right, at T-Mobile. It's again something very similar. The assumption was, if I could imagine, is that because these APIs are again, like I mentioned, non-public, but the fact that these are being used by a mobile application in an external network, even though that mobile application is actually an internally developed one, by definition, that API is a public API, right? So you really have to treat that API as just as any API that you are planning to expose publicly externally, which means when you kind of think about drawing and defining your trust boundaries, these are the things that you kind of need to put in place and have the thought right up front. And therefore, with this, we will know that just having an API gateway is not enough, because an API gateway is important and will obviously help us manage and mitigate risk through things like rate limiting, throttling or spike, attacks, etc. But with the threat models, we can then figure out how do we further define and design security into the API implementation itself. And that could be, potentially designing a specific use API for an external mobile application, even though it's an internal application, so that you reduce the risk of data leaks, or putting in place things like encryption, putting in place things like tokenization, etc., right? So like Royston said, a lot of these malicious actors, they don't actually try and hack in the way that we usually think hacking is. It's actually very sophisticated these days. They use bots to figure out what's the rate limits on an API, and then they go slightly under the rate limit, right? So to us, developers, there's nothing technically wrong with that API call, right? So those are the things that we need to start to think about. Now, Royston, right? You similarly, as you kind of shared your earlier stories, I know you also work with a lot of organizations as they roll out these APIs for public consumption. Maybe you can share with us some of the things that they do to kind of watch out for threats and attacks on their APIs.
Sure. I think as as we have in Formula One, we have this concept of race control and the safety car. And their number one job is to make sure that they're across all the events that are happening on track. And especially the safety car, their job is to make sure that they respond really quickly when something unplanned happens during the race. So whether there's a crash that they need to intervene or stop the race, that's their job. And the very best organizations who are dealing with APIs, they treat their APIs in the same way. So they're incredibly watchful with understanding how their APIs are performing and who is consuming them and the patterns that are normal. And what I see as sometimes a bad behavior is that many organizations don't truly understand what is normal for their API. So for example, I might ask them the question, there are maybe 12,000 calls to your API today. Is this normal? And it might take them more than an hour to figure out that last week it was also 12,000, and so it was the week before. And therefore, this is a normal trend. And by skipping out on that level of operational awareness, they actually potentially miss these unusual black swan events or activities that can potentially indicate that something bad is happening. And so when I talk to my most mature API developers in organizations, they're on top of understanding the key metrics that our APIs are associated with. So that might be the number of users they have, the number of calls that they get every day. At a more technical level, it might even be the CPU usage and the memory consumption. So they understand their APIs intimately. And so that way, whenever there is something unusual happening, they are able to react and respond much better, and sometimes even prevent bad things from happening because it's part of their operational planning. Now, some of us might be aware of Chaos Monkey, which is something that Netflix uses to understand their resilience on how do their systems react when something bad happens, which is when their servers get turned off by Chaos Monkey. And while that's not always something that you might want to do with your APIs, it's the kind of activity that many customers need to understand. Like how am I protecting myself from the unhappy path, and making sure that the plan to react to it is something that is battle tested, and it isn't just a theoretical plan that lives on a wiki somewhere in the organization. So really think about the APIs that you've developed so far. Who out there is actually looking at how they're performing? When is the next time they're going to be touched or updated or maintained? And if something bad was to happen, what's the plan of attack to respond to whatever it is that happens to that API? So those are a few things that I'd recommend you keep in mind as an API developer. So we're heading towards the end of our presentation today. So I wanted to take this time to just do a quick recap of what we talked about. So the key takeaways really are that there are 3 themes that Ken and I have talked about around where to focus your efforts on in terms of being an exceptional API developer. So the first one was developer experience. And that's all about the consumption and truly understanding your API and treating it like a product so that it has a community, a customer, and there is more than just the delivery of it as a technical asset and then leaving it alone. The second thing we wanted to focus on was implementation, which is all about really reusing and simplifying connectivity and really focusing your effort as an API developer on the business value and the business logic. It's not about reinventing the wheel and implementing things and spending your day doing things that have already been achieved in the past. And also making sure that once you do develop your API, that there is a plan for maintenance and versioning going forward. And then thirdly, the aspect that I see that's becoming more critical than ever is to truly understand the security aspect of your API, potentially adopting mindsets like a zero trust mindset, where you really think about how it is that you're protecting your API from bad actors and how you're protecting yourself as an organization as well from bad things. And that includes defining trust boundaries, as well as being watchful and truly understanding what are the operational elements of your API that you should really care about. Ken, was there anything that you'd want to add on top in terms of a takeaway for our audience today?
Yeah, you definitely summarize it really well. I mean, the key behaviors that we've seen here, and again, like we mentioned earlier, right? It's around these 3 key themes. But if you kind of take it back into the 2 key statistics that I shared, at the beginning of our session today, why is this important? And why is all these behaviors very important for us to really focus on and to start to think about as we develop our APIs? It's because number one, I think it is not unknown. APIs are continuing its rise, and it's rising a lot because of the new digital and platform-based economy that we are now, starting to see very, very prevalent in every part of our life. And all these are driven by, APIs. That's a fact. And therefore, we really need to think about the quality and the kind of APIs that we are developing. And it's one that is something that will be consumed by the ecosystem. So it's not just about building the best APIs and with the best kind of implementation, the coolest way of writing our code. It's not about that. That is obviously important, and we take a lot of pride as developers as we code our APIs, right? But we really need to start to think about the ecosystem as well, because that's really where we really increase the value chain of the platform-based economy. And with that, that kind of ends our session today. I'm going to take a couple of a few minutes here to kind of share some of the next steps potentially that you can take as well. First of all, definitely connect with us. You have our some short links to our LinkedIn profile there. Look us up. Connect with us. We are more than happy to have healthy debates in this topic. You may agree or you may disagree as well. And we are happy to have that healthy conversation around this. A couple of other recommended next steps as well. Become an integration trailblazer. It's sometimes it's not natural that I come from the world of integration and then into API development. Integration is actually something pretty interesting as well. And we at MuleSoft, we believe we have a pretty cool platform and framework for you as API developers to try and check out. So do become or join in, check out the integration trail blazer. And then lastly, we reference quite a fair bit from the State of IT and Business Innovation Report. Do check it out. There's a lot of very interesting insights, and you can get to it through the short link shown on the screen there. All right, with that, I would like to thank everyone for this session today. And it doesn't seem that there's any questions at the moment, but like I mentioned, feel free to connect with us and on LinkedIn and reach out to us, talk to us. Anything you want to add, Royston, before we end?
No, I just wanted to thank the audience as well for your attention, and we look forward to speaking with you at an event soon.
All right. Thank you, everyone.